Hello and welcome to a special interview for The Wire supported by Glenlivet Books. Given that vaccines are extremely good at preventing serious illness and death, but nowhere near as good at preventing infection, should we rush to vaccinate young children with COVID-19 vaccines, or should we think carefully and perhaps even consider waiting till better vaccines are available? Let me at this point cite two particular statistics that could be useful. It said that an adult of 20 years old is 220 times less likely to die of COVID-19 than a 70-year-old. And for children, the chances of death are even less. As a result, the COVID mortality rate at the pediatric level in Kerala is just 0.008%, which is virtually 0%. That reinforces the question I want to ask. Should we rush to vaccinate children with COVID-19 vaccines or think carefully? My guest is Professor of Virology at the Christian Medical College in Vellore and a member of the government's COVID working group, Professor Gagandeep Kang. Professor Kang, recently you said to the Quint, I am not sure yet if healthy children really need the COVID vaccine. Can you tell me, why do you believe that to be the case?
Well, I think we need to start from what parents want, and all parents want to protect their children and protect them as well as is possible. And as virologists, as vaccinologists, that's certainly something that we recognize. But we also recognize that you need to have as complete information as possible before we make the suggestion for what the best modality for protection really is. The situation we are in today is that there are vaccines that are being used in children in other parts of the world. These are mRNA vaccines that have been evaluated in several thousand children and have been recommended for use in healthy children as well as children who have comorbidities and are immunocompromised in richer countries in the world. Now, based on the fact that they are using vaccines and based on the fact that we know that SARS-CoV-2 infects children, should we be thinking about using vaccines? Well, actually, if we look at experts around the world, even if you look at people in the UK, the committee that they have there, the Joint Committee for Vaccines and Immunizations, debated for a really long time before it made the call to vaccinate 16 and 17-year-olds, and then made the call to think about vaccinating children who were younger. Now, the situation there is different in terms of the exposure that children in the UK or other high-income countries have had. And the situation is different in terms of the vaccines that they have access to. So can we take their decisions and apply them to our situation? I don't think we have the information that allows us to do that at this time. The two vaccines that we have available in the country, with the third one approved, Covishield is not recommended for children for children. Covaxin has been evaluated in 2 to 17-year-olds, and the ZyCoV-D has been evaluated in children who are above 12 years of age. Now, we need to remember that these vaccines were evaluated only for immunogenicity and a limited safety study. And the results for that have just about begun to be available for Covaxin and for a very limited number of children for ZyCoV-D. So I don't think it's sufficient information to make a call on vaccinating healthy children at this time. Immunocompromised children, children who have comorbidities, yes, I do think that we have data that shows that they would be protected from vaccination, but even that is a complicated story.
When you say we do not have sufficient information for vaccinating healthy children at this time, this is because, and I'm quoting what you said to Quint, we don't have enough data in India on how healthy children react to COVID-19. And you added, I would like to see better data before we decide to immunize our entire cohort of young 18-year-olds. In other words, we don't have the information, we don't have the data, let's wait till we do, then we can decide about vaccinating children. Now is not the right time.
So I can give you anecdotal data from colleagues, from friends, from the hospital that I work in, where largely the severe cases of COVID-19 that are being seen in children are in children with comorbidities. You're not seeing healthy children develop severe disease and die because of COVID-19 infection. This will happen, but it will happen at a really low rate. And what I'd like for us to have, because ultimately when you introduce a vaccine, you want to be able to measure the impact of that vaccine as well. If you don't have baseline data, where is your measurement going to land? So I think what we really need is data on how many children are hospitalized, how many children have died, and in those children, were there any pre-morbid conditions before we make up our mind that we need to introduce vaccines. If we had today a raging pandemic that was infecting everybody, that we had data that children are getting infected, healthy children are landing in hospital, that's a completely different situation. We are operating now with a low total number of cases and with very, very, very limited data on what's actually happening in children. So yes, I think we need better data before we make a call.
To extrapolate from that, and I'm putting it in layman's terms, what you're saying, if I've understood correctly, is that because vaccines protect against serious illness and death, not against infection, and children are very unlikely to fall seriously ill or die, at this stage, given the paucity of data, it is not necessary to vaccinate them.
I don't think that we should introduce vaccines into the program at this stage.
Is there any risk in giving vaccines to children? That's a different question to whether it's necessary. Does vaccination affect the immune response of children in ways that we need to be very carefully thinking about before we start vaccinating them?
So we can look at risk in two ways. One is risk as safety of the vaccine. And that we know, for example, from the mRNA vaccines, that while a risk of viral myocarditis was not seen in the trials that were done in children, there is a rare risk of myocarditis in young males. And countries need to do a risk-benefit analysis to see if they are alleviating sufficient disease for them to want to take the risk of young males having a potentially life-threatening condition. Now, do we have safety data similar to that for Covaxin, for Zycov-D, which are the two vaccines that can be used in India? For Covaxin, it's a vaccine that has been used in tens of millions of adults and has shown the odd case of anaphylaxis here, or nothing that is hugely worrying in terms of a safety signal. And you wouldn't expect it to be different from children, but you would still want to wait and watch, just like the West did for analyzing cases of viral myocarditis. So you need a surveillance system that allows you to detect signals if they happen. In the case of Zycov-D, that is a vaccine that has been evaluated in 1,400 children so far. There don't appear to be safety signals, again, in only 1,400 children. And the immunogenicity data is emerging. I understand that what's available is data only from 10 children at the moment. So I don't think in terms of safety, there is enough data for either vaccine in younger children. And I'd like to see more safety data in adults accumulating, as well as a plan for continued safety monitoring. The other aspect to look at is the immune response. And are you creating a situation where you're placing children at immunological risk by giving these vaccines in a hurry? And the potential for that certainly exists. Anytime you have a virus where you have multiple variants and your vaccine is based on one version of the various variants that are circulating, then you need to think about, are you doing the right thing by giving this vaccine to children when the first vaccine they receive might influence their response to future infection and future vaccination? This is known in immunological terms as the concept of original antigenic sin, where your first exposure to a virus influences your future responses to the same or closely related viruses. This is something that has been seen in influenza. It's something that's been seen in dengue. To some extent, it's also seen in diseases where the cellular immune response matters. For example, HIV and the hepatitis C virus. So when you approach vaccinating children and you know that the virus is evolving, you need to do it very, very carefully and think about whether the vaccines we have today really are the best vaccines for children.
You said two very important things there. First, you said the first vaccine might influence the response of children to future infections, which is very critical when you have different variants of that infection happening. And therefore, you need to be sure that the vaccine you give them is the best vaccine. And maybe you should wait for the second and third versions to emerge before you start vaccinating them with the first. But you also said something which I think for parents in particular will be striking. Your words were, we do not have enough data in terms of safety for either vaccine. That's Covaxin and the Zydus Cadila vaccine for children. In other words, we need more data before we can be confident that the vaccine we're giving is perfectly safe. That is really a good reason for saying, don't rush to vaccine now. Let's get more data and then take the decision.
On balance, I would say there's much more safety data available for Covaxin than for ZyCoV-D, because ZyCoV-D has not been used in the general population. Covaxin has. It's also an inactivated vaccine. And for inactivated vaccine, you generally have fewer safety concerns than you do for other untested technology platforms. And for DNA vaccines, we really haven't had DNA vaccines used in humans before. So certainly for ZyCoV-D, I would like to see a much larger safety database before we brought it into children. And for Covaxin, that database will accumulate. But I would also like to see, in case there is any age differential risk, then we need to have the ability to measure that. I use the example of viral myocarditis and the mRNA vaccines. It would be good if we had similar systems available to be able to measure risk in our children.
Okay, that's very clear. Certainly for the Zycod-Cadila vaccine, you need to see more data in terms of safety for children. But even for Covaxin, where you said there is more data of safety than there is for the other vaccine, even there you would like to see more age differential data. And you'd like, therefore, to wait for both of those requirements to be fulfilled before we decide to vaccinate. That I can understand. And that
the problem really, sorry, let me interrupt there. The problem really is that if you look at what is required by the regulator to approve a vaccine, everything that needed to be done by Covaxin has been done. Now, if you want to have a greater safety database, how do you get the safety database? There are two ways. One is the regulator asks for post-marketing surveillance, where you have to submit periodic, the company has to submit periodic reports saying that this vaccine is now being used and this is the safety information that we've had, the reporting over the last 3 months and then another 3-month period for usually 3 years. Now, how can you do that if the vaccine is not introduced? So it becomes for regulators that have licensed products. That's the usual approach that you take. In India, we are in a peculiar situation where the approval is under emergency use authorization, which limits use. So we need to build out a safety system that allows us to use the vaccine and then to be able to capture
can you
safety
explain
data.
that? Because you very clearly sketched out a sort of catch-22. How do you get that greater safety database without using Covaxin? And yet you're hesitant to use Covaxin without that greater safety database. So how do you overcome this problem?
Do it with monitoring. So
in other words,
so there are many
should be monitored when it's given. Not don't give it, but monitor it.
I think all vaccines should be monitored when they are given until you get reasonable safety data. And this is a requirement. You can do monitoring in multiple ways.
But let me stop you there. Yeah. I'm just a bit confused now because I began by quoting what you said to Quint. I am not sure yet if healthy children really need the COVID-19 vaccine. And you began by explaining how we simply didn't have enough data in terms of safety for both vaccines. And you also explained how the first vaccine can determine your response to infection when there are multiple variants of that infection. But now on further questioning, your position on safety has differentiated between the Zydus and the Covaxin. And on Covaxin, you seem to be now saying that we can give it, but monitor it. So in other words, safety is not such a concern for Covaxin any longer. I mean, I'm just concerned because your position seems to have changed over the interview.
My position on using the vaccines has not changed. My position on how you would generate a safety database when you have vaccines is being described in more detail. Now, do I think a healthy 15-year-old in India needs the vaccine today? I do not. Okay? The reason I think that a 15-year-old does not need the vaccine today is because we have data that shows us that 60% of children have antibodies already. They most likely got these antibodies through asymptomatic or mildly symptomatic infections, which points to the fact that, as you described earlier, very few children who get infected wind up getting anything that is moderate or severe illness. So what are you protecting against? If you want to protect against severe disease and death, then children are not the right group to vaccinate. Okay, now coming to this.
That's very clear. You said, do I think a healthy 15-year-old needs a vaccine in India today? And you answered it, I do not. I take it, if a healthy 15-year-old doesn't need a vaccine, that applies to everyone younger than 15.
I'm comfortable with young children not being vaccinated because we don't have any data that shows us that they are at high risk when they get infected. Now, that is for healthy children. Children with comorbidities is a whole different area, and we need to think about protecting children with comorbidities.
So children with comorbidities might be an exception. Is that right?
Absolutely, they should be an exception.
Would that also apply to children who live with adults who are immunosuppressed? Would it also apply to children who live with elderly people who are at greater risk of COVID? Should those two categories of children also be vaccinated?
So I think there we need to figure out what the numbers really are and whether those individuals have been protected by vaccination or not.
Okay.
So let's start with the children with comorbidities themselves. They absolutely need to be protected. Which is the best vaccine for them? Short answer, we don't know. Will it be an inactivated vaccine? That actually is a bit unlikely. There are data that are emerging from India that show that people who are adults who are immunocompromised are not responding as well to Covaxin as they are to Covishield.
Okay. So let me then, for the sake of the audience, sum up very simply what I think you've said and put it back to you. You believe that there is no good case at the moment today for vaccinating people who are 15 or younger. You've explained in detail why. There are concerns to do with safety. You would like to see more safety data, particularly for the Zydus vaccine. There are also concerns about giving them the first vaccine in a situation where the variants can change because it can affect their response. And therefore, at this moment in time, your advice is there is no reason to have to rush to vaccinate people who are 15 and younger. Have I summed that up correctly?
And healthy.
And healthy. So no reason to vaccinate people who are 15 and younger and healthy. Is that correct?
That's correct.
You also said, and this is my last question, you said this to Quint, for children who have a long life ahead of them, the first vaccine may not be the best. We may find that there may be a second version that does better. We may find that combinations of different platforms may perform better for children. All of that is arguing, let's wait for later, better vaccines. Then we will consider whether people who are healthy and under 15 should be given them. Is that right?
Better vaccines, better data.
Better vaccines, better data. Thank you very much indeed, Professor Kang. I think your advice will be invaluable for parents who care particularly about whether their children, particularly young children, should be vaccinated. And you've indicated that your belief is that if your child is healthy, there is no need to rush, wait for better vaccines, wait for better data, then we should decide. I thank you, Professor Kang. Take care, stay safe.
Thank you.
Welcome back. I'm now joined by Dr. Rajeev Jayadevan, the Vice Chairman of the Indian Medical Association Research Cell. Dr. Jayadevan, you argue that it's not necessary to give vaccines to people under 18 and in particular to young children. Can you explain why you've come to this conclusion?
We need to understand what vaccines are very good at and what they're not very good at. We know that our vaccines are excellent at preventing severe disease and deaths. In fact, Covaxin is 93.4% effective in preventing severe disease. But none of the vaccines that are used in the world are very good at stopping infections. Yes, we now know that about 10 months after the rollout, plenty of people are developing mild asymptomatic infections, and these are called technically breakthrough infections. So in other words, vaccines are not very good at stopping infections. So if we are trying to vaccinate children with the hope of stopping infection, that is not going to be a valid argument. Now, children, unlike adults, are extremely unlikely to develop severe disease and death. In fact, the chance of a child dying from COVID-19 is less than 0.008%, which is close to zero. Which is why when we try to give vaccines to prevent severe disease, it may be a valid argument for adults. It's a blessing for adults, but for children, it's a different risk-benefit equation.
Would you go one step further, Dr. Jayadevan? Would you say, fear or suspect, any of those three, say, fear or suspect, that the risk versus benefit of giving vaccines to children is different to the risk benefit when you give vaccines to adults?
Yes, it is different. The reason is children are not little adults. They have a different pathophysiology. The way they respond to infections, other diseases are different. Their disease conditions and the treatments are different. And importantly, in this context, their immune systems are different, which means that the effect that COVID-19 or the vaccine causes in children will be different from that in adults. For instance, even though a large number of people were studied in the Pfizer trial of 22,000 people in adults. They were not able to pick up myocarditis, which is an extremely rare occurrence, which means that there are some situations that occur in certain age segments. This particular heart condition occurs in younger males and older male teens predominantly. So unless we study very large numbers of children, we will not know for sure if any of these rare conditions will occur or not.
If I understand you correctly, you've said two important things. One, that the immune system of children is different to the immune system of adults. And secondly, young adults can end up with rather serious complications as a result of vaccine. And we only found out about that not through the phase 3 trials, but when vaccines were being given in reality to hundreds of thousands or millions of people. Are you therefore suggesting, and I'm only asking you for clarity, that there could be a risk that because the immune system of children is different to that of adults, they may face complications from vaccines, which we'll only discover when vaccines are given to hundreds of thousands or maybe even millions of children? And that's why you're a little concerned about rushing to vaccinate children.
Yes, I'm a little concerned about rushing to vaccinate healthy children because of what you just mentioned. Yes, if you study 500 or 1,000 or 1,500 children, well, a rare event might not even be noticed in such a small number. It is good that we are doing these trials to ascertain the safety, but much larger numbers are needed before we conclude that these vaccines are safe for widespread use among healthy children.
So in other words, let vaccines be given to children in other countries in much greater numbers before we decide to give it to our children in India. That's what it amounts to, doesn't it? Because that's how you'll find out how vaccines behave.
Well, the vaccines used in other countries, specifically Western nations, are not the same as we use in India. But still, that will give us an idea about the first point we discussed. Are they really effective in stopping infections? Because most parents do not want a child not to be infected. But I do not believe the current day vaccine, the systemic vaccines or the injectable vaccines, will stop your child from being infected if you follow them long enough.
But
for
you're
the first
also
2 months, maybe yes.
But you're also saying that let's wait to see how vaccines behave with children abroad, not just in terms of whether vaccines stop infections, but also whether vaccines produce unforeseen complications. That's also what you're saying, isn't it?
Yes, that is true, because vaccines do have a habit of producing rare but rather serious complications. Unfortunately, we are all aware of that. VITT, myocarditis, Guillain-Barré syndrome, and so on. These are very rare. There is nothing to be scared of. But when we take a decision, these matters are to be considered.
Now, you ask a question in a paper you've written, and I'm repeating that question. Is vaccination of crores of healthy children worth it just to prevent a few asymptomatic and mild infections for the first few months alone? I take it from everything you're saying, your answer is either a clear no, it's not worth it, or at any rate, you're saying, I can't say yes with certainty. I'd like to wait more time. Which of the two? A clear no, or I can't say yes with certainty. I want to wait for more time.
A clear no, because if you are vaccinating children with the hope to prevent infection, no, that's a wrong strategy. Until we have a vaccine that protects our mucosa in our nose and our throat, which is effective and safe, it's unrealistic to expect these vaccines to stop infections from happening in school.
One last question. You do believe that vaccines should be given to children with comorbidities or other vulnerabilities. You also believe vaccines should be given to children who live with adults who are either cancer patients or immunosuppressed in some other way. And finally, vaccines should be given to children who live with elderly people who are anyway at a high risk of COVID danger. Those are three categories that you believe would require children to have vaccines. Am I right?
In my opinion, yes, because when you start a vaccination process, for example, in adults, India vaccinated the most vulnerable people first, the older people and the healthcare workers and frontline workers. Likewise, in children, the segment among children or the subset among children who are more likely to develop a bad outcome are these segments. Now, the last category, that is the children as to who lives with the child, is also important because you can't treat the child as a single entity. The child is part of a family, so the child's family involves a vulnerable person, yes, I believe that that child could be prioritized for vaccination.
So to sum up, with the exception of children who have comorbidities and are vulnerable, and secondly, with the exception of children who live with people who are immunosuppressed or are cancer patients or elderly, with those two exceptions, all other healthy children, you're saying, should not be vaccinated at this point of time. We should wait and see how vaccines work with children before we decide to vaccine our own. Is that correct?
That's my opinion. And we know that a very large number of children are already seroconverted, which means they're already immune from natural infection in India.
All right, that's perfectly clear. So your advice as the Vice Chairman of the Indian Medical Association Research Cell is that don't rush to vaccinate healthy children. Let's wait a while. Let's think carefully. Let's see how vaccines work with children elsewhere, i.e. abroad, and then decide about our children. Is that right?
That's well summarized. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Jayadevan. I'm very grateful to you. Take care. Stay safe.
Thank you.